Queering Chinese Media and the Sinophone Pacific at HKU, hosted by CSGC. That's the Center for the Study of Globalization and Culture, which is currently directed by my colleague, Professor Gina Marchetti. This center hosts many events related to post-colonialism, anti-colonialism, gender and sexuality. We have a research stream called Global Sexualities, which we put our events under today, as well as China and global politics. So please stay tuned for future events hosted by CSGC. This event today is also supported by our generous co-sponsors, including CGED, the Committee on Gender Equality and Study in the Faculty, also chaired by my colleague Gina Marchetti, as well as by the Gender Study Program. We are very pleased to be launching 2 new books on queer Chinese media and queer Sinophone studies by my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Hongwei Bao and Dr. Howard Chiang. Logistically, we'll proceed with a 20-minute presentation of each author, followed by a commentary by the discussants, and we'll save all the questions after the 2 sessions conclude during the Q&A. I will now introduce the moderator of our events today, Dr. Grace Ting. Dr. Grace Ting is an assistant professor of gender study at HKU. As a queer and feminist studies scholar, she specializes in Japanese women's writers and girls' culture, as well as transnational feminism and queer politics. She's currently working on a book manuscript examining femininities and female homosociality within representations of daily lives by women writers in post-1980 Japan. Her other work involves critiques of race and gender in the field of Japanese studies, as well as interrogating tensions between concepts of queer and Asia across Japanese, Sinophone, and Asian American literary discourses. So I'll now turn things over to Dr. Ting.
Thank you, Dr. Wang, for this wonderful introduction. I'm really honored to be serving as moderator for the wonderful panelists who will be speaking today. So just as a quick note, during Q&A, I'll be asking you to use the raise hand function on Zoom or enter your questions into the chat box. But during the presentations and comments from discussants, please feel free to enter questions in the chat box as they come to mind. And I'll try to make a note of all of them and then bring them up during Q&A. So without further ado, today we will first have Dr. Howard Chiang speaking about his book Transtopia in the Sinophone Pacific, with Dr. Alvin Wang serving as discussant. Dr. Howard Chiang is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Davis. His earlier research includes a 2018 book, After Eunuchs, Science, Medicine, and the Transformation of Sex in Modern China, which received the 2019 International Convention of Asia Scholars Humanities Book Prize and the 2020 BOLA Book Award from the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality. Since 2019, he has served as the founding chair of the Society of Sinophone Studies. Published in April this year by Columbia University Press, Dr. Chiang's monograph, Transtopia in the Sinophone Pacific, uses Sinophone studies to challenge not only the Western origins of transgender studies, but also China-centric tendencies appearing in studies of gender and sexuality in East Asia. This truly interdisciplinary intervention highlights intersections of queer theory, area studies, and medical humanities. Dr. Alvin K. Wang is Assistant Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at HKU. He is currently writing a book titled Queer Hong Kong as Method, and he is also the co-editor of the 2020 edited volume, Keywords in Queer Sinophone Studies, along with Dr. Howard Chiang. So Dr. Chiang, please go ahead and start your presentation when you're ready.
Thank you, Grace. Let me begin by sharing my screen. Okay, can you guys see my PowerPoint? Okay, great. Let me put this in the full mode. All right, so I want to begin by thanking Alvin Wong for organizing this event, Grace Ting for moderating this session, and Center for the Study of Globalization and Culture at Hong Kong U for hosting this very festive session. I also want to congratulate my friend and colleague Hongwei Bao for publishing the third book. He did it yet again. So it's really great to be here. I want to kind of begin I think I have about 20 minutes to give a quick discussion overview of what my book is about. And I actually want to begin by situating this book in a context that I wasn't able to do it explicitly at the beginning of the book itself. So I hope this will help kind of situate the broader significance of the book. I want to actually go back to a conference that took place earlier this year. This is the North American Taiwan Studies Association conference. I'm not sure how many of you had a chance to attend that conference, but it's an annual conference organized every year. Last year's conference was postponed to this year. And the theme of the conference this year was keywording Taiwan. And keywording Taiwan might seem like a pretty moot point, but for a long time, scholars in Taiwan studies have been facing this conundrum. And that is, it seems as if Taiwan as a region, as an intellectual culture, has failed to kind of produce and generate any kind of theoretical vocabulary. And you guys know that Taiwan has been historically displaced with a series of colonialism, going back from the Spanish-Portuguese Empire all the way through the Qing, Japanese, American, and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist empire. Because of that, Taiwan studies scholars have been facing this conundrum of, what kind of theoretical conceptual vocabularies do we have to talk about Taiwanese history and culture? And so a group of scholars based in Taiwan and across the Pacific came to form this collective known as the Knowledge Taiwan Collective, 知识台湾. And basically they came together to think about the possibility of theory from the site of Taiwan. So that collective has published a few edited volumes, including the one you see on the left-hand side here on PowerPoint, Knowledge Taiwan, 知识台湾, and Keywords of Taiwan Theory. The whole idea of the keyword initiative here from the Sinophone site is a little bit different from Raymond Williams' keyword approach. Raymond Williams, as some of you may know, was really thinking about the genealogy of certain keywords from cultural studies and to think about the histories of these keywords. But the idea of this Knowledge Taiwan and Keywords Taiwan collective is really to think about new keywords as a way to prompting new conceptual vocabularies and thinking about frameworks for studying Taiwan studies. So I think it is useful to think about how Transtopia, in the way that I conceptualize it, kind of serves as a keyword, serves the purpose of generating new keywords from the site of Taiwan studies and vice versa to insert Sinophone into global dialogues of academic theory. And I'll just add a quick footnote to that to say that, in fact, following the Knowledge Taiwan Studies Collective, there have been other keywords volumes in Hong Kong studies, so Hong Kong keywords, 香港关键词, you can see that on the right-hand side here, but also the volume that I co-edited with Alvin Wong, Keywords in Queer Sinophone Studies. So this is to say that Sinophone cultures have always been a quite generative site for thinking about new possibility, to think about new concepts. And I see the conceptualization of Transtopia as very much generating from that spirit, intellectual spirit and interest. So I want to just say a few words about the Sinophone very quickly in order to establish a baseline for us to move forward. And by the Sinophone, I'm really following a group of scholars since the early 21st century to rethink the meaning of concepts such as the Chinese diaspora, as well as taking the growing power of the Chinese empire very seriously. We can define Sinophone akin to Shishumei's definition as a network of places of cultural production outside of China or on the margins of China and Chineseness. So we do have a Society of Sinophone Studies, and if anyone's interested, feel free to visit our webpage to check out what we're doing. We just organized our first biennial conference this year, for example. So I want to make sure that that demarcation is clear, between what we mean by Sinophone versus China or Chinese, so that we can start to think about how the way that, at least the way that I think about Transtopia and the way it decenters transness is similar to the way that the Sinophone study is trying to do to decenter China-centrism as well. So in queer studies, we often face a conundrum, and that is how to grapple with both the usefulness and the limitations of concepts or categories derived from the West. In this book, I advocate a moving from transgender to transtopia. And the goal is really to show how a new keyword can be generated from the specific context of Sinophone history and culture. I think in queer Asian studies, we have been accustomed to the idea of decolonizing Western theoretical norms. At the same time, my point here is that we must also turn that decolonizing gaze upon itself in order to avoid reinstating an opposite set of biases. And this is what I call the scaffolding of Asia nativism. I mean, this is one of the my main critique of work like Chen Guangxing's Asia as Method, is that sometimes the critique of the West oftentimes falls recourse back to reinforcing certain kind of Asia nativism. So to direct us to a kind of queer history that resists Western centrism and China centrism at the same time, I propose a new theoretical construct, transtopia. In its broadest sense, transtopia basically refers to anything that exceeds transphobia. And so I know that's a very broad and conceptual way, but in practice, I use transtopia in the book to refer to different scales of gender transgression that are not always recognizable through this Western notion of transgender. The point is to acknowledge the coexistence of different trans expressions across time and space. So in this way, transtopia deconstruct a constant and stable narrative template by which transness is often validated. This leads one to question a one-sided hierarchy often embedded in the umbrella concept of transgender, where the criteria of determination is transness, or to put it more precisely, different degrees of transness, right? So in that sense, one can be more trans and someone else can be less trans. And transness effectively becomes evaluable, measurable, and quantifiable. I think nowhere is the politics of transness more pronounced than in cross-cultural history. And this is especially true when we see the concept of transgender became institutionalized since the 1990s. What you see on the PowerPoint slide here are a host of examples, global examples, including Indian Hijras, Indonesia Warrior, Native American Two-Spirit people, and Mexicans Mushe populations. And there's a lot of terms, including in Sinophone societies, 人妖, which I'll talk about later in just a few minutes, that all falls into this platform, right? And this is the politics of transness dictates that we must feel uncomfortable with the idea that these categories of transness simply get homogenized through this Western notion of transgender. And at the same time, we're also in queer studies, we're also aware of the work that this enables by making certain local configuration of queerness legible in a global platform, right? Because this legibility allows for some kind of universal solidarity and building for some kind of transnational movement possible. So Transtopia calls for a more egalitarian platform, and as such, has literally been crying for a name for itself. I'll say that the ethical component of Transtopia, and I am talking about the ethics here, is concerned with less, who qualifies as properly trans, than with how different actors relate to one another through this notion of transgender. This is where I really borrow from the feminist theorist Adrienne Rich's insights considering the lesbian continuum. This is to think about lesbian existence as a universal form of existence for all women. So we can similarly think about transgender and conceptualize it as a continuous category. In the book, I ask, what if transgenderism is not the exception, but the norm by which all embodied subjects came to be measured and understood? So the book actually goes on to talk about a lot of different examples. I'm cautious of time, so I'm going to try to race through some of these examples. I probably don't have time to go to the third example, for example, but feel free to raise questions about it during the Q&A discussion if you're interested. But the overall point I'm making here is that the merging of trans with topia, the prefix with the suffix, occasions a generative tool to disrupt the stability and coherence of knowledge about the past. Okay, so the first example, the global Christine example, is something that I discussed toward the end of my first book, After Unix. This brings us back to the summer of 1952, which saw the nationwide publicity showered on the MTF transsexual Xie Jianshun. So Xie was a native of Chaozhou Canton. She had joined the army at the age of 16 and lost both of her parents by 18. She came to Taiwan with the Nationalist Army in 1949. And in the summer of 1953, the 36-year-old Xie visited an army hospital in Tainan because of regular abdominal cramps. Doctors soon diagnosed Xie's intersexuality and initiated a series of sex change operations. So what is most fascinating about the Xie story is that it really made the Chinese word for transsexual, 变性人, a household term in the 1950s. Her story soon triggered media sensationalism in post-war Taiwan. And one of the things that struck me when I was doing the research on Xie Jianshun was that I constantly came across references to Xie Jianshun. Commentators constantly labeled her as the Chinese Christine. And the label actually was a direct reference to the American XGI transsexual celebrity, Christine Jorgensen. So as some of you may know, the American Christine traveled to Denmark in the early 1950s for her sex reassignment surgery. And when she came back in the early 1950s to New York, she kind of surrendered to her celebrity. She became immediately a worldwide phenomenon. And she was very popular globally. You can tell because of some of her self-intentionally kind of fashioned glamorous femininity, glamorous looks as well. So the analogy between the two Christines in the 1950s really reflected the growing influence of American culture on the Republic of China in the initial peak of the Cold War. And as it turns out, the story of global Christine did not stop there. So we have so far seen the Chinese Christine, we have also seen the American Christine. And around the same time, Nepal Medical University in Tokyo had also performed similar surgeries on the Japanese Christine, Nagai Akiko. So the operation was supposed to be performed to treat Nagai's penile cancer. But after Jorgensen returned to New York, the government in Mexico soon claimed that they too have their own Christine. So Mexico City dailies newspapers announced the sensational story of Marta Olmos, the Mexican Christine, in May 1954. And so I just want to pause here and to just elaborate on this point very quickly, in that, you know, what we're seeing here is a very interesting moment, right? In the 1950s, in a short span of a year and a half, you go from the American Christine to the Mexican Christine. And a lot of times, you know, when we think about queer theory and trans theory, we tend to think about a lot of abstract concepts. But here we are actually dealing with a very concrete phenomenon, something that we see that all cases pitched, you know, sex change as the fulcrum of bodily experience. But what is very interesting is that the narratives that were generated about what sex change actually meant in these different locations differed significantly, right? So the American Christine, the story there was really a story about personal triumph. Jorgensen was able to travel to Europe to fulfill this destiny, to fulfill what Christine Jorgensen had always dreamed of doing. But the case for Xie Jianshun, as we saw, was very different. It was actually a cure. The surgeries was a cure, so to speak, to fix Xie's intersexual conditions. And in fact, I should add that Xie initially actually resisted these surgeries, and Xie actually underwent a series of 9 surgeries in total, very reluctantly, to transform into women. And for Marta Olmos, the medical team in Mexico actually pitched the surgery as a way to fix Marta's earlier male homosexuality, right? So what you're seeing here is that you have a different narratives of Christine, of sex change being generated from this very specific same, around the same time, and seemingly cohere around the same bodily phenomena. So my point here is really that we need to start paying attention to subjects like Xie Jianshun and Martha Olmos, not because, right, they're just a non-Western variant of a Western original copy. I mean, the relationship between the copy to the original is already troubled and is precisely what is problematic in the first place. But we need to pay attention to Xie and Olmos due to how they unsettle claims of transgender roots that are locked to a particular time, place, or set of social attributes. These examples frustrate any definitive claim of trans authenticity. It no longer makes sense to uphold a single figure or a single location, usually the modern West, usually Christian Jorgensen, as the ultimate yardstick for the historical production of transness. Okay, my second example of a transtopian construct is actually one that has long circulated in Chinese history. So this is the concept of 人妖. 人妖 literally just means a human monster. The term originally referred to any human kind of physical anomaly or freak. To the best of my knowledge, this term first appeared in the philosophical writing of Xunzi from 3rd century BC, and was really referring to kind of human prodigy pitched against heavenly prodigies, 天妖. But the very first time in which this concept of 人妖 came to assume a kind of gender crossing meaning occurred in a book called Nanshi, History of the Southern Dynasties, right? So this is a book about Southern Dynasty, but it was actually written in the Tang Dynasty. So that's the first time that 人妖 came to have this gender crossing meaning. I should point out that throughout Chinese history, even though there are examples where the term of 人妖 is associated with gender crossing, this meaning oftentimes coexisted alongside the broader definition of human freak or anomaly. So for example, in this pictorial, you see how a baby was born, seeming with a monstrous appearance. And so the family actually drowned the baby, calling the baby Yao, right? So the baby this incident had nothing to do with gender crossing per se, but the 人妖 designation was referring to a human freak, kind of human anomalous kind of formation. 人妖 is a concept that illustrates, I will argue, what Western queer theorists have more recently called queer inhumanism. So in my research, I showed that throughout the late Qing and early Republican period, this category basically gradually came to surrender the idea of inhumanism, the non-gender connotation of literal inhumanism. When 人妖 became a concept that can come to describe human gender transgression, it uplifted the moral category of 人妖, but also kind of displaced this earlier genealogy of queer inhumanism. Now, by the time we get to post-1949 era, mainland China remained relatively silent on the topic of 人妖. But in contrast, as we saw, Taiwan not only publicized the surgeries of Xie Jianshun, but also became a place where the lay public was bombarded with stories about Zheng Qiuhuang, who was arguably the most famous 人妖 in the 1950s. So I'm highlighting the part of Taiwan here on the map here to give you a sense of where so Zheng was actually charged with multiple charges of fraudulent offenses, criminal activities, and that is basically where he was born and mostly where his activities took place in central part of Taiwan. So throughout the 1950s, there's like 4 waves of media discussion about Zheng Qiuhuang. Okay. So part of my book goes into great detail about Zheng Qiuhuang's case, but I want to take this opportunity to make one point. And that is, of course, gender ambiguity of Zheng was perhaps the most important selling point of his story, but a crucial turning point came with 1954. As you may remember, by that point, the idea of human sex transformation had circulated widely in Taiwan due to the story of Xie Jianshun. So at that point, Zheng was actually quite dazzled by the Christines and stated for the first time in 1954 his determination to undergo sex reassignment. So my point here is that, for a long time, right, this is not the first time that Renyao has been associated with this notion of changing sex, switching sex. But this was the first time that someone called Renyao came to articulate the desire for a sex change operation. Okay, this became a chief force in shaping the public understanding of Zhen's Renyao embodiment from this point onward, this association with 变性人 transsexuality as a newly identity category. So the connection to sex reassignment marks a decisively Sinophone contribution to the history of Renyao. So when we're thinking about Renyao, which is a recurring concept in Chinese culture, alongside 变性人, which is a new identity marker, it reveals their interconnection. Both categories took form in seemingly different Sinophone contexts, and different configuration of transness kind of took shape alongside with one another. But they also suggest that if we actually consider the transsexual, like Xie, as more trans than the human prodigy, Zhenqiu Huang, I think this flattens the historical nuance and the cripples our queer sensibility. The queerness of Zhenqiu Huang's Renyao status derived from not only gender ambiguity, but all sorts of subversive behavior. As his declaration of interest in sex change makes clear, these two configurations of transness were mutually shaped and understood by actors in relation to one another on a historical continuum. Okay, so as a Chinese category, Renyao has roots in continental China, but its most elaborate articulations manifested in mid-20th century Taiwan. So again, the point here is not to measure the earlier Renyao examples against later ones or other non-Renyao queer subjects for that matter. We must not start with a preconceived set of trans criteria. The affinity between Renyao and transgender is precisely what is at stake and needs to be thought through cautiously. In today's parlance, Renyao often represents an insulting and transphobic term. We also see certain queer reappropriation of the term. But as I've shown, the queerness of Renyao can be understood as an outcome of a historical process. It is a process that approximates Taiwan's stature as out of sync with these imperial giants, China, the United States, and Japan. So like Taiwan, Renyao has been left out of mainstream queer historical comprehension. And similar to Renyao, Taiwan has been objectified as an historical aporia that sits uncomfortably with narratives of colonialism, nation building, and global cosmopolitanism. Okay, so the next part of my talk actually goes in greater detail about the history of Tongzhi politics. I won't have time to go over that, so feel free to open a discussion about it during the Q&A. So this talk has dared to map the discrepant and multi-directional origins of transness as a troubled but vigorous crucible of global epistemology. Like Chakrabarty's call to provincialize Europe, it is time to think about not just gender trouble, but the trouble with transgender. And I'll conclude my talk there. Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation and the tantalizing slides that you weren't able to talk about. So Dr. Wang, can you go ahead with your comments, please?
Yes, and I will try to shorten my original 10 minutes so we can proceed to Hongwei's talk quicker. Howard Chiang's Transtopia in the Sinophone Pacific makes a stunning intervention into the existing fields of transgender studies, Sinophone studies, China studies, medical humanities, and the very practice of history writing itself. The introduction of the book describes the author's discomfort of attending the inaugural Queer History Conference in 2019, while across the Pacific, social movements and protests erupt in Hong Kong in the summer of 2019. The social movement in Hong Kong assumed what Chiang called a planetary salience. Yet no one at the Queer History Conference seems to bother to situate the legacy of Stonewall alongside what happens in Hong Kong 50 years later. Struck by this disconnect that separates queer history in the modern West from social struggles elsewhere, Chiang argues that one major aim of his book is to introduce the specter of the Chinese Empire to the study of queer struggle and to engage in a transversal mode of thought. The rest of the book performs this transversal mode of thinking beautifully through the innovative concept of transtopia. While Chiang makes it clear throughout that his aim of introducing this concept is precisely not to delimit a quantifiable degree of transness or who and what counts as transgender, his book does indeed offer several powerful articulations of the concept. First, Chiang writes that, quote, "I use transtopia to refer to different scales of gender transgression that are not always recognizable through the Western notion of transgender. To the extent that this usage captures specific ways of being in the world, it represents an ontological intervention. At the same time, transtopia enable different ways of knowing in which transness appear less as a fixed entity than as individual and structural gradation that fundamentally ground most, if not all, facets of human life. In this sense, it denotes a critical epistemology. In a more capacious sense that explores the disciplinary formation of transgender studies, Chiang, quotes, presents transtopia as the antidote to transphobia, and frames it in terms of a continuum model that accredits the diversity of experience and situates this new vocabulary in relation to the practice of critical history. While the continuum model draws inspiration from Adrienne Rich's famous essay on the lesbian continuum, it also far exceeds Rich's original model by showing how the stick of transtopia spans across discrete temporalities and global geographies. So I want to very quickly sum up how I see the major concept of transtopia performing interventions into the existing fields. And so I'll go through each chapter fairly briefly. Chapter 1 advances the notion of a strategic structuralism, which reframes transgender as a social structure as opposed to a minoritarian identity. While it also builds on the foundational definitions of transgender by Jack Halberstam and Susan Stryker, which emphasize transitivity across gender identity, embodiment, and variance. Howard's emphasis on the continuum model is more interested in how transtopia emerges from a web of historical relations in which transness gains intelligibility. This chapter, I think, was also very ambitious and very successful in that regard. And thinking through how this transtopian thinking might have already emerged by mid-20th century sexual science. And here, Howard turns to the model of sex orientation scale, SOS, developed by Henry Benjamin. And Benjamin's model actually categorized transsexualism as a higher degree on the continuum scale, while assigning transvestism as type 1 to type 3 at the other end. And throughout the 60s and 70s, transgender individuals in North America and across the world actually responded to Benjamin's model, wrote letters, request surgical intervention, revised blind spots in his theory, and in turn shaped the contour of modern sexual science. From this global historical framing, Howard also connects Benjamin's, Hirschfield's, and Kinsey's work on sexology to different lesbian cases of murder, love murder stories, including one in Memphis, another one in Hangzhou. The Memphis one was in 1892. of Alex Mitchell, and the one in Hangzhou was in 1932 in Zhejiang, China. And the other one by Zahra Amin and Mahin Padagdar Nasser, who murdered Zahra Amin in 1973 in Iran. And the point is that Howard shows how the mathematical concept of asymptote can enrich transtopian thinking. And in all three cases, lesbian desire gone mad is almost always linked to the murderous lover's gender ambiguity and transgender masculinity. So when revisiting these cases, it is both about lesbian love, but it's also about gender variance and female masculinity in some ways. So here, a transtopian thinking draws on the concept of asymptote and in mathematics, and it does not assume the priority of either lesbianism or transgender, but rather push the limits of both categories. And chapter 2 also offers a powerful manifesto that demonstrates why queer theory needs Sinophone studies, while urging queer historian and queer theorists to put the historical exceptionality of Stonewall aside. While the original story of Stonewall perpetuates a Western centrism every time the event is narrated, an area studies respond that valorizes cultural nativism of LGBT experience in the non-West is equally untenable. Chiang therefore calls for treating Stonewall as a lateral event. And this chapter also demonstrates how Sinophone studies in its critique of the long-distance nationalism of diaspora studies, of continental colonialism within China, and of settler colonialism, how Sinophone study can then unravel the habitual binary of the West versus the non-West within queer theory, or otherwise the romanticization of queer Marxism in the Two Chinas models by Petrus Liu. So I actually love, this is the chapter that I find that I was very excited when I was reading it, and it's also very teachable. I actually plan to assign it to my class in the fall. The several reasons why queer theory needs Sinophone study is that number one, it helps to historicize the translation process of terminologies. Number two, it is against the romanticization of China and the legacy of global leftist politics. Number three, it enables the study of global indigeneity that draws connection across linked systems of oppressions. Number four, it moves beyond the framework of post-socialism in the study of China. And there was a beautiful reading of Stanley Kwan's film, Nan Yu. And number five, it offers a model of queer regionalism that points to minor relations. And number six, it allows us to overcome certain phonic bias in Sinophone studies towards queer sound studies. And Howard also did a beautiful reading of Happy Together by Wong Kar-wai. And finally, this also critiques the habitual heteronormativity of China studies as a co-war byproduct of US academia. The rest of the book showcased the expansive scope of transtopian thinking in multiple directions. So for example, in chapter 3, Howard already talked about the critical genealogy of Yuan Yao. And so I won't talk about, I'll skip that part, but it's very crucial that in that chapter, Howard also extends the work of Angelia Rondica, Ann Stoller, and Lisa Lowe, and shows how the act of history writing itself is already a form of archiving, and how the genealogy of Yuan Yao, as Howard pointed out, mirrors the very status of Taiwan. In chapter 4, Howard maps the transtopian continuum through a concept of intercorporeal governance and situates the material bodies of history and the inscriptive mode of embodiment in Sinophone cinema through, and of course also literature, through reading the figuration of Chineseness and global politics in M. Butterfly, Pharaoh, My Concubine, Sorman II, and Reign of Assassin. And ending the chapter with Derrida's notions of supplementarity. The last chapter, chapter 5, provide a critical genealogy of the debates of the anti-social thesis in queer theory. And by showing how, while there is a rush to critique neoliberalism and critique gay marriage and queer liberalism in the queer global left in the US, oftentimes this sort of critical work bypass the actual work of thinking about processes of creolization and localization in globalizing Asia. So this chapter calls for a transtopian move of creolizing transgender by looking at the expansion of Tongqi politics, Tongzi as a comrade, as a shorthand, as an umbrella term to include most sexual minorities in Chinese, in the Sinitic language communities. So it looks at the expansion of Tongqi politics in post-martial law Taiwan through transgender activism, while also looking at the legal adjudication of transgender rights in Hong Kong in the W case versus registrar. And it points to how the queer regionalism of Hong Kong being sort of situated and trafficked within the imperial citationality of colonial Britain and a powerful PRC is something that we still need to think about and come to terms with. So overall, I would say that Howard's book really draws on the multi-directional critique of Sinophone studies, and in turn shows how a transtopian thinking across disciplines such as queer study, trans studies, and medical humanities will propel these fields into other kinds of queer possibilities. So as a sort of ending my remarks, I'd just like to ask 3 brief questions, and I'll type those questions again during the Q&A. Number 1, would you say more about how transtopia as a concept overcomes certain blind spots in transgender studies and queer theory? And number 2, in terms of how transtopian thinking is also a multi-directional critique, what can it offer to Sinophone studies? And finally, the book's conclusion touches briefly on a post-area studies formation. So in what ways do you see the temporal and spatial riches and case studies and examples in your analysis in the book as pointing towards this post-area studies and post-American studies formation? So I would love to hear more about that, sort of the future orientation of your work. So with that, I'll turn back to Grace.
Thank you, Alvin, for all your wonderful comments. So I guess Howard can address them at the beginning of Q&A, but for now we're going to move on to the next book. So we have Dr. Hongwei Bao talking about his book Queer Media in China, and Dr. Jamie Zhao acting as discussant. Dr. Hongwei Bao is an associate professor of media and cultural studies at the University of Nottingham, UK. His other books include Queer Comrades, Gay Identity and Tongzi Activism in Postsocialist China, published in 2018, and Queer China, Lesbian and Gay Literature and Visual Culture under Postsocialism, published last year. Published by Routledge at the end of May this year, Dr. Bao's book, Queer Media in China, is a wide-ranging examination of films, film festivals, zines, and websites produced by, for, and about LGBTQ people in China in the 21st century. This book is a fascinating look at relationships between media, queer communities and identities, activism, the state, and the market in China. Dr. Jamie J. Zhao is Assistant Professor of Communications at Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool University. Her writings can be found in journals such as Feminist Media Studies, Continuum, Celebrity Studies, and Critical Asian Studies. She also co-edited the anthology Boys Love, Cosplay, and Androgynous Idols, Queer Fan Cultures in Mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. So Dr. Bao, please feel free to go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Grace, for your kind introduction, and thank the Center for Globalization and Culture for hosting this event again. And I also congratulate my friend Howard Chiang for publishing his second monograph, and among many other books. So I had the privilege of reading the book manuscript and wrote a book endorsement for the book. So congratulations. So it has been a pleasure to read Howard's work and to learn together with Howard. So I'll share the screen now. I hope you can see the screen. So can you see the screen? Can I check? Yeah, brilliant. I saw some raised hands, so that's good. Okay, so in this book talk, I think I'll make it really brave, talk about my own experiences and my process of developing the book. This is probably the softest book, or the kind of most autobiographical book. So those who have read my last two books will know that I use a lot of first person narratives and experiences and intertwine the kind of the queer community history with my own personal experiences. And this book is of no exception. So basically it's a process of writing the book from Queer Comrades to this book, Queer Media in China. I'll finish with a structure of the book by giving you a rundown of the table contents. So where does it start? It started in 2001. So in 2001 on Peking University campus in Beijing, so the first queer film festival at that time, it was called China Lesbian and Gay Film Festival, took place at Peking University's library. And the event was kind of received low publicity on campus at the time, but it was soon actually covered by kind of international newspaper, which caused some trouble for the organizers, because the organizers faced some pressures from the venue providers. And then the festival had to close earlier than usual. But that was one story. And then at that time, I was on Peking University campus as a student studying journalism and communication. I was quite frustrated with my study at the time because, well, I didn't feel that my learning of all those journalism theories and so on would work in China. So I already made up my mind that I wouldn't like to be a journalist in the future. And I saw the poster of the event, I mean, a couple of days before, but I didn't go to the event pretty much because a lot of the titles I've already seen through bootleg DVDs, and even the blockbuster at that time advertised for the festival, Lan Yu. You could get a bootleg DVD on university campus. I mean, on one of those, I mean, secondhand booksellers or DVD sellers. So basically, that was a missed encounter with this event. And of course, I didn't realize that was the first Beijing Queer Film Festival, and I later had to have a lot of encounter and engagement with the festival. And for an ordinary person or ordinary gay identified person living in Beijing, those queer activism couldn't be much further away and couldn't be more irrelevant. Because, I mean, if you take care of your own life and if you have your whatever lovers or sex partners and friends, etc., you could live a very comfortable life without talking about rights and activism. But during that period, I also had the access to reading Li Yinghe's translation of queer theory, and then log onto some of the gay websites, and even, I mean, had access to some of the gay publications, such as the Friend magazine, which was an HIV/AIDS magazine, but had a lot of LGBTQ content. it was not until I started my PhD in Sydney, Australia, did I really start actually to take what queer activism and queer media seriously. So it was in Sydney, Australia in 2007. So Cui Ziren, China's famous queer film director, was invited to Sydney to give a talk. And then the event organizer, UTS, also screened several of his films. And I was really shocked at seeing some of the aesthetics of Cui's films. It was very avant-garde, experimental, and in a way shocking, because most of the time, at that time, I watched a lot of whatever Western gay films and was familiar with the kind of narratives and aesthetics, and this kind of underground and avant-garde aesthetics really surprises me. And started to think about potentially doing a PhD in queer theory, in queer studies. So basically writing about queer culture in China. This was encouraged by my supervisors. So one is a cultural theorist and the other is an anthropologist. But thanks to my supervisor, they also encouraged me to go to China to do some field work. So I wasn't trained as an anthropologist, but I was sent back to China and then contacted Cui Ziren. At that time, it happened that they had some film screenings, and in particular, the film screening of Queer China, Comrade China, a newly made film, a newly made documentary about China's queer activism at the time. So I participated in the screening and met some filmmakers and activists. And when one of them mentioned that they were going to Guangzhou and other cities for film screenings and community events, I volunteered to follow them. So this was pretty much the start of my field work and my encounter with China's queer activist communities. And of course, this is a particular experience because the first group of people I've encountered are mostly filmmakers and media producers. So that was why that my account of the kind of media production and activism occupy a very central place in my writing, even in my PhD thesis, Queer Comrades, which I didn't realize at the time that media would be so important for me. And then I also participate. As an ethnographer, I was told that you should observe, things very carefully, objectively, and with a distance, etc. But at that time, I simply couldn't do so because I was soon actually asked to do things such as translate film titles and write articles for film catalogs and even chair events, etc. And I had this dilemma of whether I would actually keep my critical distance towards the object of study that I'm studying. But soon there's an ethical, in a way, obligation that because other people have helped me so much, I should do something in return. So I got increasingly involved in China's queer activism. So all this translated into my PhD thesis and my first book, which is Queer Comrades. So for this book, actually, I was trying to think about the term 同志 comrades. So after Zhou Huashan's famous book and after lots of critiques to Zhou Huashan's book, and it seemed that 同志 became a kind of problematic term in the Chinese and Sinophone sphere, etc. However, there was obviously a use of 同志 in mainland China's queer communities. So I was thinking about how did this term came about in the mainland Chinese context, and what did the term do in the process of the fast development of China's queer communities and activism. So that was basically my endeavor to draw a genealogy of the 同志 subject and its associated activism in the PRC context. But I soon encountered another problem, which is that if I talk about queer activism or 同志 activism in China, what is activism exactly? So of course, it's easy to identify that some forms of activism, such as film screenings and or a kind of confrontation between gay men and the police at Central People's Park in Beijing. But what about the other forms, such as the proliferating queer cultural productions in China, including those zines and literature and films and art and so on and so forth. So I use my second book pretty much, I mean, a few years after my PhD to think through this question about activism. So what may constitute activism in the contemporary PRC context? And because of my object of study, which is basically queer cultural production, so which is actually pretty much a kind of specificity of its own time, because the kind of gay pride politics wasn't possible and is still very difficult in the PRC context now. So people have to come up with creative ways to engage with the communities, to represent identities, etc. So literature and visual culture seems to be one of those prolific and powerful avenues for articulating queer desires. But meanwhile, they are more interesting actually than the kind of identity politics that we are familiar with. So which is that they construct politics, but there's also enough space actually for these kind of identities to be deconstructed, to be interpreted in different ways through audience and reader engagement and so on. So with this book, I'm trying to think about what is queer in the Chinese context, in the transnational context. What's the relationship between queer subject formation and China's social changes in the past decades. So that's the second book. But still, I mean, I haven't still figured out the role of identities and communities in queer subject formation in the Chinese context, because it's very easy to critique identity and community, seeing identity and community as an oppressive regime, or accusing them of identity politics and staying away from them. But obviously, they do something in real life. A lot of people are attached to identities, and with the construction of identities, particular types of activism becomes possible. So this was really my focus for my book, Queer Media in China, which is I use this examination of queer media activism to see how identity and communities are at the same time enabled by media activism, and at the same time constructed by media activism or practices surrounding media. So basically, this is a book that I use on the one hand to engage with media and communication studies, which I'm situated in, and on the other hand, to think about the importance of media for identity and community construction without reifying notions such as identity and community. So this was basically the starting point for my book, Queer Media in China. So again, with this book, I'm trying to think about identities and the kind of creative use of identities without subscribing to identity politics. I'm trying to actually to look at those communities of practice and communities of care without actually buying into the notion of a homogeneous community, notion of the community. And at the same time, I'm looking at particular use of media, and in particular, communitarian, political and activist use of media in the contemporary world for political and democratic purposes, and so on. So from the disciplinary perspective, I'm also trying to engage with media and communication studies overall, and Chinese media and communication studies in specific, about what does media do and how media relates to the society, the state, and so on, since most of the media studies literature are based on the kind of mass communication and mass media paradigms. Of course, community media would prompt us to think about the media's role in relation to state and society in different ways. So I divide the book into 4 sections. So section 1 is pretty much a kind of contextual section, which provides a historical and theoretical concept of queer community media. And in this section, I also provide a kind of genealogy of queer community media, from magazines to telephone hotlines to today's gay dating apps and hookup apps, although I don't focus on those media in my book. So this book pretty much focuses on the digital forms of media, in particular digital documentary filmmaking, to see how documentary filmmaking practices have participated in identity and community building. So in part 2 of the book, I analyzed 2 documentaries to see how they represent queer community histories in China and what are the politics of representation. And then part 3 deals with different types of media and screen activism with the help of media, and in particular community media. So my case studies include Queer Comrades, which is a community webcast, and Beijing Queer Film Festival, which is a community festival and event which is still running now. And the last section moves the kind of queer community media to a transnational context and see how the kind of global north, global south relations, together with the kind of interactions and transnationalism within global south, may shape queer community media practices as well as activism. So altogether, I think that I'll skip the slides. So basically, these are some of the examples and case studies in each chapter. But altogether, I'm seeing research as an archiving practice together with Howard Chiang. So when putting together this book and when conducting research about China's queer community media, I am building or participating in building a queer history of China and transnationally. And at the same time, departing from the kind of objective gaze from the kind of outsider ethnographer, I'm trying to think about the use of participatory action research as a part of activist practice and the research practice as a form of activism. So that's pretty much my introduction of the book. Your suggestions and critiques are welcome. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Hongwei, for that wonderful introduction to all of your work. I felt like I was kind of going on this really great journey along with you as you explained everything. So Dr. Zhao, if we can have your comments, please. Thank you.
Sure. Let me share the screen first. All right. So can you see my screen now, the PPT? Okay, I think I'll leave this this way so I can also see my notes here. Is that all right? Okay, so anyway, thanks for inviting me to attend this joint book launch and to discuss Hongwei's newly published book in 2021. I think for this kind of joint book launch event, this is the second year in a row we are doing this with Hong Kong U. But for me, serving as Hongwei's book discussants, this in fact has been the fourth or the fourth or fifth time for us to do this kind of events together, right? So anyway, I have also chaired and moderated Hongwei's online and offline talks many times since 2017, starting from the one held at Warwick, right? That's how we met each other in person. So we have been know each other for quite a few years. We were online friends before that. Anyway, it feels so good that we can continue doing this kind of events during and after COVID-19 and see, many old and new friends doing well virtually, right? So Hongwei actually ordered me a copy of this book right after it got published. So when I was reading it, I saw Hongwei wrote this in the acknowledgement part where he said, quote, this book was completed at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in summer 2020. At times, I was not even confident about whether I could survive the pandemic, unquote. So what I want to say in my discussion of queer media in China's book is, first of all, I want to say that thank you, Hongwei, for working on and finish this book during the most impossible, the most difficult time. This is really quite moving, touching, and encouraging to me, and perhaps also to all the other queer students, scholars, practitioners, and also people who are interested to learn about Chinese queer media and cultures in the past 2 decades. I guess this, I think it's confident to say that this book is the most useful and the most comprehensive work that captures the history, transformation, struggles, and potential of queer media activism in China, which, as Hongwei puts it, is transnational in nature. I know Hongwei will have his 4th book forthcoming, so hope we can do that again next year together. Anyway, the first page of, as you can see from the slides, the first page of the slides actually is with the covers of Hongwei's 3 monographs together. So in the middle is his current, most recent monograph, Queer Media in China. And the one on the left is Queer Comrades, which was published in 2018 with NIAS. And the one on the right is Queer China, published last year with Routledge. So I remember in 2 events in Birmingham and in Shanghai, held in 2018 both. I was also the discussant for Hongwei's first monograph, Queer Comrades. And in 2019, I reviewed his second book, manuscripts, and I also reviewed his writings many times for other journals and presses. For instance, 2 chapters in Queer Media in China, this book are reprints with revisions from journal papers included in my guest edited special issues. So I'm very familiar with Hongwei's research in recent several years, I guess, and from reading and reviewing his 3 monographs, I can see some major progresses or changes have been made. So, for instance, the focus of his research has shifted from queer political identity, the Tongzhi or Comrades identity formation in the first book, to queer natured art practices, theatrical performances, as well as cyber queer fan literature in the second book, and then moved to community-based activism in the past 2 decades in mainland China in the current, in the newly published book. Also, in the later 2 books, the attention has been given to queer women's culture and media. I especially appreciate this shift because, as I discussed last time, last year, the event with Hong Kong U, I said there seemed to be a deeply rooted hierarchy within LGBTQ culture, community, and also related scholarship in which gay men associated cultures and representations have been not only more visible and commercialized, but also further studied and discussed in academia. For example, I remember when we discussed Hongwei's book in the 2018 book launch event held at Shanghai University, where Elvie and Howard were both there. I think Howard and I both pointed out that 同志, this term even being used in China's LGBTQ community is often closely associated with gay men. Whenever we want to refer to lesbians in Chinese-speaking context, we use 拉拉 or 女同志. So Tongzhi-related culture sometimes cannot represent what has happened in trans queer women community. So that was like 3 years ago, right? At the time, there were not even so many like males or gay men identified scholars writing about trans lesbian media and culture. I remember only like Elvi and our mutual friends, Zhao Xiyan, who's also here today, published journal papers about lesbian and transgender filmmakers or films before. Even today, you can look at how many queer trans scholars published research on TikTok and online gay male celebrities. Yet we still rarely see research and publications on queer female live streamers and online celebrities. So in response to this, this not necessarily a criticism because it's not Hongwei or anyone else's fault. It's just a fact. Queer women's media and practices in China is a severely underexplored, if not unexplored topic. So Hongwei in his second and third books actually studied the media forms like online GL fan literature, girls' love fan fiction, and also lesbian and queer women digital filmmaking, which helps fill this gap. Another expansion I can see in Hongwei's writing in the queer media in China is that he added extensive discussions of how to understand and use queer, this term, in trans media environments, industry studies, and related research. And sorry, and also he also discussed the unstable, often self-contradictory media censorship system in China in the third book. So this is especially important, I want to say, for studies of a social cultural environment with more and more queer images and connotations being commercialized and celebrated in mainstream media, industries and public spaces, while queer community media being produced and circulated also help to build effectively participatory communities. So we need to pay more attention to how this has been made possible and regulated. I think the definition and understanding of queer, in particular in transmedia studies discussed by Hongwei in the new book, is especially worth quoting here. On page 17, quote, this book situates queer in a non-Western and global South context. It conceptualizes queer as a form of social practice and imagines a type of queer studies focusing on social practices. Queer can also be used as a verb, queering over to queer, as a way to challenge the heteronormativity embedded in institutions and society. For example, queering media and communication studies is to challenge the heteronormative assumptions in conventional media and communication theories, methodologies, epistemologies in both its noun and verb forms. Queer can be productively conceived as a social practice. What people do with queer shapes non-normative identities, communities, and politics, unquote. So this is exactly what we have been trying to do as queer Chinese studies scholars with a growing number of publications in the field. This is, or we can say this is what we meant by queer China studies, or like what previous scholarship has called why China needs queer theory. We actually, like, by bringing both Western and Chinese conceptualization of queer not only as an identity category, but also as a practice. We would like to map out a more sophisticated picture of the burgeoning media and cultural landscapes concerning gender and sexual non-normative images, productions, and communications in an increasingly digitized transnational China. So I especially enjoy reading this book as it historicizes various forms of queer community media, as mentioned in the book, like pager or QQ chat rooms, etc. In fact, I invited Hongwei to give a talk to my undergrad students here once in Suzhou. I mean, he was talking about this relatively old forms of media, and my students were all like born after the year of 2000. So they were like, pager, what is that? QQ, they never heard of, you know. And also, whenever I was talking about like Baidu, Tieba, Postbar, or Tianya Luntan discussion forum, this kind of popular online places for LGBTQ communication like 15 years ago in China, right? They were like, oh my God, they're so old. Do you even ever heard of Douban or Weibo, whatever, this kind of new forms of social media, right? So anyway, it's nice to see a documentation of this older media platforms or ways of communication and see how they made significant impact on today's digital queer culture, as Hongwei also discussed in the book. I remember in 2017, I was asked to write an entry on new media in Asia for the Global Encyclopedia of LGBTQ History, edited by Howard. So by the time, the only piece I found about earlier queer use of pager was a book chapter by Audrey Yu from the book titled Mobile Cultures, edited by Chris Berry, Fran Martin, and Audrey Yu, published in 2003. So I want to say like Hongwei's historicization of queer community media and this kind of older forms of queer media is also very, very crucial and indispensable for today's queer Chinese media studies. So I would like to raise some questions or possible research directions for Hongwei to perhaps give some comments on. The first one is about audience. I feel there might be more spaces in your future projects or publications to discuss audiences of queer community media in China. I wonder if this queer community media discussed in your new book potentially drives away some general audiences who are not particularly interested in queer representations, or who might be confused by queer aesthetics and thus feel less interested in this form of LGBTQ, more related media. Because I feel, well, queer community media helps to form very intimate affective communities. It's also a form of more like niche media with particular groups of target audience. So it's also quite different from what we have seen from today's Chinese commercial media industries, right? Where same-sex intimacies and the queer tensions are appropriated and high profile to both heterosexual and LGBTQ audiences. Like you also, I remember you also briefly discussed in your book with the concept of queer baiting. I remember you mentioned you used this concept several times in your writing. So I wonder if you see a convergence of these two forms of queer media, queer community media and queer commercial media, or not, or perhaps you don't even think there would be any disjuncture between these two forms of queer media exist. Anyway, so yeah, that's all I got for today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhao, for your comments. So before we move on to Q&A, I thought maybe this would be a great point to have Howard and Hongwei respond to the comments from the discussants. So I'm not sure exactly what order you want to go in, but maybe Howard first.
Hongwei, did you want to respond first? I saw that you opened your mic. I can go first. It's up to you.
No, please go first.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so thank you so much, Alvin, for the wonderful comments. A lot of fruit for thoughts, and I'm gonna try my best to address these questions. I'm not gonna have time to go over them very, very thoroughly, but I did have some ideas prompted by your wonderful remarks. I remember the first comment is about how Transtopia overcomes blind spot in trans and queer studies. So I have a lot of ideas I can share with you. I'll just pick on one for now. You'll see that the book actually mentions, for example, the work of a very important queer theorist, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. So Sedgwick, especially with her book, Epistemology of the Closet, that book, along with some of the other queer texts, have often been considered as foundational to the field of queer studies. And I think with Transtopia, we are entering, in many ways, I think we are entering a new era, right? So when queer studies came to dominate in the field, like as a mode of critical inquiry in the late 1980s and 1990s, oftentimes second wave feminists kind of responded by thinking that, oh, so it's kind of like queer theory is now taking over discussions of gender and sexuality. You do see some, you know, in terms of the history of these movements, intellectual movements, you do see some of that. You see not only Cedric's work, but also Gil Rubin's work, for example, as well as those sex-positive group of feminist scholars, where they began to theorize sexuality as a separate domain of inquiry, right? So that goes in hand with queer theory. And I would say that Transtopia is now, in some ways, asking us to reconsider the relationship with gender and sexuality in very critical ways, right? It's not as if trans studies comes along and tries to dominate again. Like, it's not as everything can be subsumed under trans studies. Although I'll say that one thing that Transtopia calls attention to is the very fact, you talked about those lesbian examples in chapter 1, is the very fact that I think we actually need to be very mindful of the limits of the categories that we have, right? How do we know that the subject that we're recuperating from history identify as gay or lesbian? I think trans studies does call attention to the possibility that maybe trans offers a more productive way for thinking about the identification and subjectivity of these historical actors. But I think Transtopia kind of calls attention to that very juncture between homosexuality and transgenderism. So if Cedric told us that the whole modern Western society and humanistic inquiry is plagued, right, by this fracturing of sexual binaries, heterosexual, homosexual binary. I think that it's useful to supplement Cedric's comment by saying that it basically goes without saying that we need to call attention to how homophobia and transphobia work together in conjunctural ways, right? If Cedric's work, queer theory, was based on this anti-homophobic inquiry, as Transtopia is now calling attention to precisely the relationship between homophobia and transphobia. So that's just one very quick response. I have other remarks. We can talk a bit more about that later if we have time. Now, but I want to answer a very crucial question that you raised about Transtopia as a multi-directional critique and what it offers for Sinophone studies. As you recall, in the second chapter of the book, I talk about why queer theory needs Sinophone studies. So this is in some ways a very smart way of also rephrasing the question and putting the gaze, putting it upon itself to think about what Sinophone studies can learn from Transtopia. And I have two quick responses. One deals with the topic of today's session is queer and trans studies. I think that a lot of times Sinophone studies, sometimes there is growing body of scholars like yourself and myself who do pay attention to gender and sexuality issues, but gender and sexuality issues are not always at the center of Sinophone inquiry. So Transtopia does push discussion of gender and sexuality to the center of Sinophone inquiry. So some of the examples I mentioned briefly, including the legalization of gay marriage in Taiwan, including the W v. Registrar of Marriages case in Hong Kong, as well as the Ye Yongzhi case in post-millennial Taiwan. All of these cases demonstrate, right, queer Sinophone culture is not just theory. It's very important that Sinophone, as a way of looking at the world, is a theoretical input, but it's also reality. Right, queer Sinophone culture is already part of the historical process. So I think that offers a very important supplement, if you will, or offers a very important point of intervention, saying that gender and sexuality must sit at the center rather than peripheral to Sinophone studies inquiries. So that's my very first quick response. I'll say the second response I have, and I try to do in this book, and a lot of my work, is to really bridge this dialogue between medical humanities and Sinophone studies. You know, I'm trained as a historian and philosopher of science. So I've always been really interested in thinking about how we can bridge these existing conversations in history and philosophy of science. You know, like people like Foucault, he was a historian, philosopher of science as well, right? So how can we bridge these discussions with queer studies and Sinophone studies? I think Transtopia offers a way of doing that. When we start to think about material embodiment, and we think about what I call intercorporeal governance, it now pushes the field of Sinophone studies beyond the pure obsession with linguistic resistance or linguistic governance to think about intercorporeality. So I think, you know, for a long time, Sinophone studies, something has been decisively absent from the field of Sinophone studies is this sustained engagement with critical studies of science and medicine. And by looking at the plural forms of medicine and therapeutic forms of expression, I think it also pluralizes the way Sinophone studies transgresses boundaries of culture through material and bodily negotiation. So I think bringing medical humanities to a discussion in Sinophone studies is equally germane. Okay, so I'll just say very quickly that, you know, your third question is fabulous in thinking about how Transtopia as a post-identitarian nexus of inquiry, as a post-identitarian method, also tries to push for post-area studies and post-American studies, Asian studies, so on and so forth. I mean, I think the key there, right, is once again boundaries, right? If you think about how these field formations, whether you're talking about American studies, whether you're talking about even gay and lesbian studies or trans studies, a lot of time that's built on some notions of identity basis, right? Whether it's American identity, whether it's trans queer identity. And with those identity categories comes with these boundaries to define what charts the terrain that falls under this concept. So the staticness of area studies, regional studies, and the static boundaries of identity, I think the way that they run parallel is very interesting. If anything else, one of my hope in this book in coining Transtopia and drawing attention to the Sinophone Pacific as a productive site of scholarly conversation is to really ask us to be mindful of the political violence of boundaries that comes with nation state, that comes with empire. Because sometimes we think we do have systems, institutions that upholds the naturalness of nations, the naturalness of empires, even in invisible imperial ways. So in many ways, right, the way that trans and queer identity categories, the way that they permeate our lives in very diffused ways, they also operate on these invisible, implicit ways of supporting, reinforcing certain kind of identity categories. So if there's a way we can draw attention to that parallel between the violence of political boundaries of nation states and the violence of political boundaries of identity, queer identity categories, I think that's one way we might start to think about ways to go beyond an area studies and regional studies paradigm.
Shall I follow up?
Sure, Hongwei, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, sure. So thank Jamie for your kind and generous comment. So it has been a pleasure to work with you over the past few years. So I respond to your suggestions briefly. The first one is with regard to the question of the audience. The audience is very important. In fact, actually, in my research, I also engage with the audiences. This is pretty much because of the particular type of media and cultural production that I'm examining. So more often than not, for those kind of small community media, their producers are often their audience members, and their production shapes the kind of audience engagement processes. So that's very important. But I'm also aware that my current focus is on queer production culture. So therefore, my focus is not on the kind of ethnographic study of the audience engagement per se, but more on the kind of queer cultural production and what kind of conditions have facilitated a particular type of representation. With regard to your second question, which is a queer commercial media versus queer community media, and of course there is convergence, and in today's China, we'll probably see more of queer community media, queer commercial media than community media. For example, people would probably use kind of Blood, and they'll watch some boys' love drama and so on and so forth. So these are extremely important form of queer media. However, they are not the object of my study, simply because of, research expertise and time and so on and so forth. But I also want to point out one thing, which is a kind of this kind of hierarchy of aesthetics and taste within queer communities. So and of course, there's a question of accessibility. So whether everybody has access to those queer documentaries and community media forms. But on the other hand, even within the queer communities, there is a kind of embrace of commercial media and very much influenced by the kind of global queer aesthetics, considering certain type of queer films to be more interestingly artistic, more audience friendly, and so on. So this in a way actually marginalizes local independent productions. So in that a lot of those queer independent films are made low budget with a one-man band or one-woman band, and then they were trying to engage with the communities, but without big commercial support. So in a way, actually, I see the kind of current marginalization of the more independent forms of queer community media. So that's why I want to highlight the importance of independent productions and activist forms of media in a context when activism is rendered difficult and when the kind of independence is increasingly difficult in today's China. Thanks very much.
Thank you for these responses. So I guess we'll move on to just open up Q&A to everyone. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll try to catch you and call on you, or you can also send a message in the chat box. Maybe attendees are still trying to let everything sink in. So here's a question from Jieming, do you want to unmute yourself and ask this question over video or audio?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for your wonderful presentations. And the question I'm asking here is that could both Professor Chiang and Professor Bao elaborate more on queer Marxism and the post-socialist approach in the Chinese and the Sinophone context? Because from the presentations, it seems to me that the two of you have quite different opinions on these theoretical frameworks and their assumptions. Thank you.
Shall I? Okay, thanks for your question. This is a very important question. So in my first book, Queer Comrades, I had a kind of intellectual engagement with Petrus Liu and other writings in queer theory. So my stance is that there are still actually useful elements within Marxism to be rescued, and we can Marxism can still actually inspire some of the important queer thinkings in today's world. So I'm not talking about the Sinophone world. I understand that's a different context, but at least in contemporary China, due to its particular historical trajectory, the contemporary subject formation, as well as the contemporary social movements are in a way inspired by or partly draw on China's historical experiences. I think this is an aspect that should be recognized in the kind of PRC context. But this experience cannot be overgeneralized. But at the same time, we see the kind of global neoliberalism, which tries to homogenize or tries to shape queer identities and desires in particular ways. So there is a need actually to address those queer liberalism and neoliberalism in a critical way, and Marxism is a very powerful tool.
Yeah, I think I'm probably speaking out of place. I think Alvin's the more appropriate person to comment on queer Marxism and queer anti-capitalist critique in the Sinophone context. I think that Marxist critique has a lot of potential and value if it were to ask us to call attention, especially to the intersection of sexual oppression and class-based forms of oppression. So it's very important. But my problem tends to be about the execution of how queer Marxist critique has been carried out. So, for example, in the context of Sinophone Taiwan, the way that queer Marxism has been understood and conceptualized, especially in the book by Petrus Liu, has often kind of bypasses a lot of the on-the-ground grassroots development of gay and lesbian politics and trans politics as well. So from the perspective of a Marxist critique of such heteronormative institutions as the legalization of gay marriage, there's a lot that can be said, right? Because there's a lot of class-based assumptions and biases embedded in some of these mainstream gay and lesbian political movement. But because when you're dealing with the context like Taiwan, there are different political strands and there are different grassroots movement as well. I think the picture that you get from Petrus Liu's book on queer Marxism in Taiwan, I mean, the strongest part of that book, I'll say, is how Taiwan can also be considered as a form of sexual illiberalism. I mean, the reminder of that is actually very important. But it does bypasses a lot of the very important grassroots frameworks and procedures that I try to document in this Transtopia book as well.
I'm looking for other questions now, but I don't see any yet. Is it all right if I ask as moderator, if I step out of my place and ask a very general question? So I think Howard was talking about critiquing the nation state and area studies and so on. And so this is just a really broad question that you can answer however you want. But I was wondering how you see your work in relation to parts of Asian studies that do not involve Chinese speaking places, so outside of Chinese studies or Sinophone studies. So how do you kind of see your work intersecting with work in Japanese or Korean studies or other places? So maybe this sort of still puts us in the framework of Asian studies or East Asian studies, but I was curious about this question because I'm from Japanese studies, and also maybe if how you see your work in relation to like Asian American studies or trans-Pacific studies and so on.
Thank you, Grace. That's actually a very important question because if we, as scholars who sometimes are trained in the field of Asian studies, we're often very much required, right? Not only in terms of the linguistic skills, but also knowing something about the research norms within our discipline. And truth to be told, I was trained supposedly as a historian of China, late imperial modern China. And I mean, we were not trained really to think about how artificial these boundaries are. So I think one point of lesson I think Sinophone studies does offer is to think about, well, how can the world connect? Now, if we're to look at through the lens of language or through other ways of networking, that it exceeds, right, these artificial, and they are artificial political categories. Talk to any scholars of nationalism, they'll tell you how fragile nationalisms are. So to go beyond these categories, I think is very, very, categories of political units and linguistic-based units are very, very important. So Sinophone studies, obviously, if you look at, for example, Southeast Asia, it is a world, right? Not only of Sinophone speaking cultures, but also Anglophone and other places too. When you look at Taiwan, right? It's a history of Sinophone, Japanophone, even Anglophone speaking cultures. So I think this kind of intersectional approach, I'm not just talking about identity categories, but intersectional approach to thinking about how linguistic cultures always overlap in these communities actually suggests that there's a lot of potential for thinking about inter-Asian citationality. So that is, I think, from the angle of language, right? When you look at a place like Taiwan, you have to deal with Japanophone as well as Sinophone histories at the same time. It doesn't make sense to just leave out Anglophone or Japanophone and when you think about the history of Taiwan. So that's from the angle of language. Now, because we are dealing with queer studies and trans studies, it's very interesting that, as a vector of expression, queer identity and trans articulations, as a vector of subjectivity, sometimes the queer and trans actors themselves often go, travel across borders. So when you look at the history of sex reassignment surgery in East Asia and Asia Pacific, for example, you see a lot of actors traveling across the borders. For a long time, and this may come as a surprise, Singapore was actually a hot spot for surgeries in the 1970s. And then it morphed into Thailand in Southeast Asia. And this is, of course, before some of the Sinophone Society's surgeons took on the task of performing these surgeries a little bit more consistently. So then some of the patients in Taiwan, if they didn't want to go to Thailand because it's too risky, or it might be cheaper, they actually decided to stay in Taiwan. But I'm just saying, right, these networks of queer expressions and queer interests actually already take us beyond these purely artificially constructed categories of political units. So I think that's from what a queer expression perspective also offers. And one key word that we kind of have mentioned, but not a lot, and I'll mention that now, is empire, okay? And if you talk to some of the world historians like Frederick Cooper, they'll argue that, in fact, the whole business with nationalism and nation states, that's a short business. That's actually very short-lived. When you look at the longue durée, the history of the world is filled with empire histories. It's actually empires that are at stake. So in many ways, I think if Sinophone studies has this critical potential to critique different formations of imperialism, I think that Sinophone studies societies and the way that intersect with other East Asian and Asian Pacific societies is that it calls attention to modes of imperiality. And that's what Sinophone studies scholars like try to do. Alvin's work, for example, also calls attention to the way like Hong Kong relates not just to these imperial giants like Britain or China, but that Hong Kong can build these minor to minor relations to other places. And a lot of times these minor to minor relations emerges from inter-imperial relations as well. So I think from that perspective, for a scholar like yourself, for example, who specializes in Japan, I think there's a lot of potential there. If you start to think about, especially given the fact, right, Japan is the most important modern forms of Asian empire in the early 20th century, the way that it was able to build an empire across the Pacific, the fact that it was able to defeat a European nation in 1905, all of that stuff, I think serves as a fertile ground for thinking about how Japanophone and Sinophone societies and cultures can intersect. And I think that is, I'll say, by the way, I've been saying too much, so I'll shut up. But I'll say that I think that is actually a very fruitful endeavor, because a lot of times Sinophone studies scholars and Japanophone studies scholars have ventured into similar topics, but they haven't really think about how they intersect. So that intersection, I think, is very, very promising.
I don't know if Hongwei has an answer before we move on to these other questions, or
Well, not really. I mean, I agree with Howard in saying that paying attention to those border crossing and minor to minor transnationalism, forms of transnationalism that potentially challenge the national borders and the logic of empires are important. So for example, the study of the queer universities, which is a study of the queer activists from China and Africa working together. So basically to define the heteronormativity as well as nation state boundaries. So there are different types of transnationality and minor transnationalism. So within Sinophone, that's a very important aspect, but there are also other geopolitical and geographical crossings and transnationalism that is equal worth of attention.
Thank you for both of these answers. I'm just always so inspired by queer Sinophone studies, and I actually think there's so many differences between what you call Japanophone studies, like there's nothing called queer Japanophone studies. But let's move on to Gina's question. So Gina, do you want to unmute yourself and ask this question? Or maybe, oh. Maybe I'll just read this question then. So both of you really help us to fill in gaps between queer theory and China the Sinophone. So could you say a little more about the reception of your scholarship in various parts of the world? Do you feel like you're making more of an intervention in the US, UK, or in Asia? This is a really great question.
If I could tag my sub question onto that, because I think that's a great question for Hongwei too. I'm a bit curious how Hongwei, in the way you present your work to different audiences, whether you think Western queer theorists respond to your work differently from people who work in queer Chinese studies. I'm just kind of, as a side note, you don't have to answer that question if that's too much, but I'm just curious, adding to Gina's question, I'm always very curious about that part of your work. Hongwei, I think you
unmute yourself.
You want to try to unmute yourself?
Sorry, thank you for your question, Gina and Howard. So as a queer scholar, what I've learned is to queer the kind of dominant discourses. So basically I'm situated in media studies, and but also I'm conducting a research that I really can't openly talked about in China. So well, I would say that my research is in a way, actually very marginalized in the British context, because in a way, actually, few people would see the importance of Chinese queer culture to the kind of Western theory canon. But I'm trying, in recent years, I have been trying my best actually to work with or to have engagement with China's queer communities. I mean, fortunately, the online space is one of the productive avenues for such a conversation and dialogue. I've interviewed, have conversations with queer artists, filmmakers, and activists. So through the kind of dialogues, I'm hoping to generate some kind of interesting synergies about queer thinking. But at the same time, I'm also actually, in a way, smuggle a little bit in the kind of university discourse. For example, Jamie kindly invited me to give a talk at one of the research centers that she chaired. So for that specific research, we are required actually not use actually the term queer, not to talk about queer explicitly. For a queer studies scholar, that is almost impossible. So what I do is that I'm talking about food practices and intimacy during the pandemic. So in a way, I think that I've learned a lot from the queer filmmaking practices. So if one road doesn't go through or isn't that open, then probably think about other ways. And queer people have learned to exist and to fight for their spaces in different ways throughout history. And perhaps what we are doing and what I'm currently doing to have conversations with the kind of Chinese language queer communities and academics is a way to smuggle a little bit queer content into the discussion and to queer the dominant discourse.
Thank you, Gina, for the question. And I'll respond very quickly, because this is something that I face on a day-to-day basis. Well, on a day-to-day basis, I work and teach in the United States. But when I travel and go back to Taiwan, for example, I converse with a different set of scholars, right? Different groups of scholars who are facing different kinds of intellectual problems that saturate Taiwanese academia. So they are related, but they're not always the same. And I think this is something that both Sinophone studies and queer Sinophone studies kind of faces when we are, depending on what kind of audience that you're communicating with, the different set of debates will emerge. I mean, in the context of the United States, for example, Sinophone studies is already connecting, right, these different fields, including post-colonial studies, ethnic studies, as well as area studies paradigms in the context of the US. So for example, when you think about how Asian American history and Asian American cultural studies are done, typically, when I speak to my colleague who specializes in Asian American history, what they're really interested in is normally Anglophone Asian American history. I mean, the archival sources that they engage with and the text that they engage with are Anglophone sources. So Sinophone American history obviously opens up a whole new set of possibility. We know that there's a lot of well-known writers who ended up actually lived in the United States for the later part of their career, including Bai Qianyong, Zhang Ailing, and they all kind of engage in this kind of tension between Sinophone and Anglophone literary production. So I think there's a lot that need to be done. I mean, in my own book, I try to bring in M. Butterfly by David Henry Huang into a discussion of Sinophone discussion. I mean, it wasn't that hard anyway. The whole historical backdrop was the Cultural Revolution. So there's already a kind of Francophone, Sinophone engagement, even written in the synopsis itself. But there's a lot that I think that can be done when we start to think beyond these nation-based categories. There's another thing I think that Transtopia and Sinophone studies trying to do here in the context of the United States. And that is, part of the reason why I asked Hongwei that question was also resulting from this observation, in that, in the context of publishing in English and in the West, when we want to converse with Western queer theorists, Whereas if they're just dealing with American culture or European culture or British culture, they can always, right, sue these generic titles, gender trouble, as a very famous one, female masculinity, as if they're already universal. They don't need any geographical specificity. But when someone like Hongwei or myself publishes our books, we're often expected to mark our title with these what Ray Chow calls locational realism, right? So for example, queer media in China, Transtopia in the Sinophone Pacific, because that's the only way where our work can be made, quote unquote, legible to the critics in the West. So I think it is a conundrum that if we're able to move beyond those sets of expectations, if we're able to move beyond those set of what Rachel calls locational realism, I think there's a lot that we can offer here from queer and transtopia perspectives as well. So that's kind of facing the US academia, and there's also its own publishing norms and so on and so forth, own sets of academic hierarchy. But in the Taiwanese context, my work faces a different set of issue. And most importantly, so I teach regularly a Sinophone Studies seminar with National Zhongxin University. And the discussion there, you know, in Taiwan, there are both the fields called Hanxue, which is sinology, and then there is increasing a field called Taiwan Studies, Taiwan Yanjiu, that emerged in the early 21st century, mostly because of political reasons, of course. And that's only possible because of post-martial law. Now, so what I'm saying here is that both Taiwan Studies and to a lesser extent, sinology, in the way that it is practiced in Taiwan, they're both Chinese/Sinophone, right? They're mostly engaging with these linguistic or dialectical skills. But of course, Taiwan studies also open up different sets of inquiries. When you think about how Taiwanese films, Taiwanese music, Taiwanese culture, and indigenous culture, that's kind of the realm of Taiwanese studies where sinology tends to neglect in Taiwan. So Sinophone studies intervenes in that regard. But this comes a very important question. That is, if in the context of Taiwan, if there is already a field of Taiwan studies, why would you need a field known as Sinophone studies? Why do you need that concept? I think this is a similar problem that people in Hong Kong study faces, right? If we can just start with the local, we can start with the regional, why do we need a cosmopolitan? And I think that question is already betraying the question itself, precisely because if all you start with is the indigenous or the local Taiwan studies or Hong Kong studies, sometimes a lot of people working in these fields tend to miss the transnational and cosmopolitan aspects of their work. For example, Taiwanese government has instigated this kind of Nanxiang, southern-facing policy. And the way that Taiwan connects with Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia Pacific sometimes get eluded and missed by scholars who are very invested in just building a Taiwan studies for Taiwan studies' sake. So those are the different kinds of conversations that I think I come to engage and negotiate with once I bring my work and once my work is faced with the Taiwan studies audience. But I'll say very quickly, though, that's not entirely not entirely it, right? So I begin my talk today by telling you guys a little bit about the Knowledge Taiwan Collective, by sharing with you guys a little bit about the Taiwan Studies Keyword Collective. I hope it also goes some extent to suggest that even some of the people who work in local Taiwan studies, they do have this mindset of global cosmopolitan outlook from the get-go as well. So it's not entirely true that Taiwan studies, for Taiwan studies' sakes, always misses this cosmopolitan part.
Thank you so much for these really nuanced answers. So actually, Alvin has a question. We have about 2 minutes left. Do you want to ask your question now, or should we go ahead and call this event to a close? What do you think?
I think I can, yeah, I think, you know, both Howard and Hongwei already talked quite a bit about that aspect, and I'm happy to have an individual dialogue with them to follow up. So yeah, I think we can just close the event if no more questions from other members of the audience.
So thank you so much to all the panelists from today and to all the audience members as well for joining us. When there might be other things you could be doing outside right now over the summer. Alvin, do you have anything else you want to add? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace, and thank everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.